Hey everyone, my name is Matt, and today I'm going to show you how I made these frame and panel doors for the upper case of my secretary desk. Now there's some really awesome features to these doors, such as these amazing crotch figure panels, this really cool curved top rail, and an integral bead detail that goes around the interior of the door frame. So although I built these doors in the last couple of months, our story actually begins a few years ago. So this was the second time that I went out into the woods with my friend Jim. I had just met him about 3 weeks before this day, and Jim had spotted this huge cherry tree a few days earlier. We removed it because one of its main limbs had snapped off, probably in a storm. This doesn't kill the tree, but over time, as water continues to get into the wound, there will be a rot infiltration that will continue down into the trunk of the tree, which will ruin the chances of getting great lumber out of this in the future. It is the largest cherry tree that we have ever come across.
That is a big cherry tree.
My dad was in town visiting this weekend and tagged along with us for the day. So here's a younger me chaining up the logs so it can be pulled out of the woods with the bobcat. Now that was a bit of a challenge due to his size, but Jim is an incredible bobcat operator, and once he got it going, he didn't have any problem keeping it going and getting it out of the woods. A few weeks later we had a sawmill day, and this log was one of the logs that we had milled. We wanted to cut the log to preserve the crotch, so some adjustments had to be made to the log in order to get it to fit through the throat of the saw. Here's one of the boards that I will be using for the doors coming off the sawmill. It was also at this point that Jim and my dad tried to convince me to buy the entire stack of boards. In the end, it took home about 7 of them. So here are a couple of those boards a few years later, after they've dried. So now let's look at sourcing the door parts from these boards. So down here I have this nice crotch figure, and this is exactly what I want for my door panels. So this side here and then this one over here will become my door panels. And my door panels are 12 inches wide, so I have plenty of space here. Let's see, this is 12 inches from the sapwood to the crack here. And then the panels need to be about 36 feet long, or 36 inches long, which is down about here. So this here will be the panel, the stock for the panel, somewhere in there. That's roughly what one of the panels is going to be. And then if you come over here, this is some nice, really straight grain material here. So this is going to become the stiles for the door right here. And the same thing will happen on this one as well. About 36 inches down. Let's start about here. So that's the panel here. Now this one might be a little different because a straight line from here is only about 11 inches, so I might have to actually rotate this one a little bit in this direction so it's more like that, sort of, which is fine still. And then over here again, I've got some nice stock for stiles. Probably only one of them. This here has a knot in it, so I'll have to find a stile somewhere else as well. All right, so now for the upper rails, which have a curve in them, there's a great spot down the other end of the board, which I'll show you now. So down here, there's this great section where the grain is coming along like this, and then shooting up over this knot and then going out again. So because those top rails are arched, this is gonna be perfect. And the top rail there only needs to be 13.5 inches long. So this is gonna be my top rail right here. So I have an offcut from another board like these ones that I used for the desk lid, and I'm going to use that because it has the same figure in it, or the same grain going on here. Since it's a little wasteful to just cut up this big board like this, the other board I have here is in a lot better condition, doesn't have this big hole in it. So this one I don't mind sacrificing. And then over here, you'll see I have some nice straight grain material here for the two lower rails. So this is a piece that I had from before. It's an offcut from when I made the lid for the desk, and this here is the piece I just cut. So what I did is I made a little template of the finished upper rail. This is what it's going to look like when it's done, and then I kept this lower piece which fits in here, so I can actually remove this and I can look at the grain pattern as it flows around the curve. So let's take a look at this one first, and we'll see what kind of grain we have here. So in here we have this big defect, which normally, if I'm trying to cut a piece that's 5¼ inches high, this would get in the way, but in this case it's not going to matter because this will be part of the arch that's removed. And this is perfect because you can see how the grain really just flows up and around like that. It's actually a pretty good tracing of the grain there. So if I take my inside curve and I place it on here, I can really see where, how the grain is actually going to flow over the curve and where the defects start. So they kind of start down here, and the grain really starts coming up and around right down here. So if I were to put this in here or so, right around there, that kind of gives a nice look here, which I like a lot. So now I'll just take my template, I'll bring it in and set it in where it's going to go. And maybe I'll just kind of outline this so we have an idea what it's going to look like. Just rough right now. And this will have a tenon on it as well. So that's what the finished piece is going to look like. And I might want to move it up later. We'll see. After I mill it up, I'll lay it out again and kind of see where it all ends up. Now over on this one here, I think this is actually a book match, or pretty close to it, of the same defect. And we're going to do the same thing here. You can kind of see that the grain again picks up here and goes like that. So if I put this piece in here, I know I want to remove all this defect. I can put it in here, and that'll probably be pretty good. What I'm trying to do is line up where the peak of the grain is. So the grain is coming up and around. I'm trying to line up the peak of this grain curve with the center line of my template, just to keep it all looking pretty good line. I think the center point's actually more or less here. And actually this one might actually be rotated a little bit just to make it a little nicer. I like that a lot. So I'll put my template on here again, remove this, and I'll trace it out. Okay, so you can see how this one's actually rotated. So by laying it out now, I can make sure I cut this piece in a way that gives me enough room to actually make this. If I was actually just to cut this, say I was just going to cut it like this, that's not going to be enough room, and I would say I would lose part of this nice figure here and this nice curve of the grain. So by laying it out first before I actually rough it out, I can really figure out exactly where I need to cut it. And I know for this one it's going to be an odd cut. It's going to be more diagonal. So if I can connect a line like this, it's going to come in like that. So now that I have both my top rails laid out, I can begin rough cutting my stock here to length and width. So here I'm doing the rough layout of the panel onto the board. I'm drawing the cutout line about an inch oversized in width and about a few inches over in length. This will allow me to see exactly how the grain will look in the final piece and give me some rough cut lines. With all my parts rough cut, I can start milling them down to thickness, starting with flattening them on the jointer. Now when I mill my parts to thickness, I like to do that process in 3 sessions, allowing the boards to rest a few days between each milling session. This gives me project parts that stay very flat and true. In this first milling session, I just remove enough material to roughly clean up the rough sun look of the boards. Since the panels have these large cracks in them, I need to stabilize them. To do that, I'm going to fill the cracks with epoxy. I'll add masking tape to the back side of the panel to contain the epoxy. I'm using wet system epoxy and I'm tinting it with trans tint. I use 1 drop of bright red and 4 drops of medium brown per batch or pump of epoxy. Once the epoxy is well mixed, I can just dump it into the cracks. Okay, so now I'm at the point where I have all my pieces milled to their final thickness, and I kind of want to go through and get everything laid out where I want them to be in the project. So I know the final length for my stiles is going to be about 32 inches, so I can kind of take a look and see if there is, like on this one here, this one is 43 inches long, so I have to remove 10 inches. So I can remove it from that side, I can remove it from this side, I can remove it from a combination of both. And that's kind of what I'm going to do here, is I'm going to go through and look at each board and just sort of see if there's anything I want to remove. This is a good time if you want to remove any defects, or if there's just something you don't like in the board, this is a good time to remove it. This end of the board here is actually figured. I can see some of the curl coming through the board down here. So this side I'm definitely going to want to keep, so I'm going to probably just take off a little bit on this end and then keep the rest of it. So this board will end up being cut right around there. This one here is probably going to be good as is. I'll just cut this end off here. I got some tear out down there. This one's about the right length already anyway. And this one has got a ton of figure in it. And it has a lot more on this end, and it has a little crack here. So I'm going to remove about an inch from this end, and then whatever's left for my final length is going to be down here. So this will be cut right around here or so. And I'll do the same thing for the bottom rails. The tops are a little different. They are going to be cut so that the peak of their arch remains right in the center. So on this one, the center point is going to be right around here, so I'm going to keep it symmetrical to both sides. But the lower rails, it's a little different. One thing I like over here on this rail is it has this really crazy bit of figuring right here in this corner. And unfortunately, a lot of that's going to be covered by the tenon. But if I can trim this piece to be right on that edge there, I might be able to incorporate a little bit of this figure into the final piece. So that's what I'm going to do here. So now it's time to cut all my pieces to their final length, and then I can start making some doors. Once I had all the door parts cut to their final width and length, I cut the tenon shoulders on the rails, and the next step is to do the final layout of the arches and cut the inner profile out. And I just cleaned up the cuts from the bandsaw on the spindle sander. Now to continue work on the doors. I'll run a bead on the inside edge of all the door parts. Next I'll cut a groove for the panels. This is a 1/4 inch wide groove, 1/4 inch deep. Next, I'll lay out the locations of the mortises in the stiles and cut these mortises with the mortiser. Next, I'll create the tenons on the rails. I shoot for a tenon that is a little too large for the mortise, so I can fine-tune the fit by hand at the bench. I'm using my shoulder plane here to thin down the tenon so it fits perfectly into the mortise. I also spent some time cleaning up around the base of the tenon. With the tenons fit, the next step is to miter the inside bead. I'll get the setup dialed in and use a stop block to make sure the cuts are located correctly for both sides of all the rails. And next I'll make the miter cuts on the stiles. Now I'll remove the bead from the stiles by setting the fence to cut right along the bead shoulder. Now that the door frame construction is complete, I can start working on the panels. The first thing I need to do is cut them to size. I'll lay the door frames on the panels and move them around until I find a layout that I like. Then I'll trace the inside profile of the door frame onto the panel stock. Before I cut the panel out, I need to extend it so that it'll be large enough to go into the grooves on all four sides. On the straight sides, I can just measure over and draw a new line, but the arc on the top is a bit different. Here I actually have to draw a new arc that has a greater radius than the one of the top rail. To do that, I first draw a center line, and using my dividers set to the known radius of the top rail's arc, find the origin point. Then to draw the new arc, I just increase the radius of my compass by 1/4 inch. I'll then cut the top, bottom, and one of the sides on the bandsaw. Joint the side I cut and rip the other side on the table saw. At the bench, I clean up the profile with a rasp. Next, I can raise the panel with a panel raising bit at the router table. I ended up leaving my panels thick, so I had to raise the backside as well so that it would fit into the grooves without the front profile being just too deep. So now I want to focus my attention on the transition here where the router gave me this rounded profile, and I want to square that off so it matches the profile on the rails. And to do that, I need to continue this arch down so I know where to carve, and that's really easy. I have my dividers, I have my pivot point from earlier still here on the board. I can set my dividers in that pivot point, set the distance to the top of the arch here, and I can just swing down and make my marks. And then to get the guidelines for the flat spot here, I'll just take my ruler and connect the two corners and then draw the line. Alright, so now I can start removing some of this material. Now for the curve here, I'm just going to rough it out with a straight chisel for now, and then I'm going to come back with that carving gouge in a little bit to ease the curve. Now the next area I'm going to focus on is down here. I'm going to try and make this curve and this straight area just kind of meet. And that's really easy to do. All I'm doing is referencing my chisel right on this flat and then just kind of following forward. There's not much material down here to remove. Okay, with my two corners made, I'll take my ruler, and I'm sighting down from above it here. This is kind of awkward. But then I'll just take my ruler, line it up with the corners, and then draw a line. So that's the line I'm going to work towards as I try and get these two things to come back into that point. So the first thing I'm going to do is just take my chisel and chop on that line, just to establish a little bit of a, I guess you'd call it like a break point or something. And I'll just come in with my chisel and just work that back, just referencing again on the flat area here before it gets into the corner, and just cutting forward. So I'm working on a section of this crotch area, so the grain here is really tough. It's pretty dense, and there really isn't a great grain direction here. So the chisel needs to be very sharp, and I'm also doing more of a slicing cut by pivoting my chisel into the work. Now as I get towards the top here, this chisel is kind of getting too wide, so I gotta switch to a narrower chisel and keep working. See, this corner here is getting in my way. Alright, that side's pretty close, and now I'll switch to the curved side. Again, I'm just resting my chisel right on the curved surface and just kind of coming forward until I find the cut. And on this one, I can actually use the top of the arch here as a pivot point that allows me to slice the grain. Probably clean up a little bit more with a little bit of sandpaper, but all the carving is done, and now I can do the other side. After sanding and scraping the panels for what was probably hours, I could pre-finish the panels. I'm using General Finishes Armor Seal, and I apply it with a rag. I applied 5 coats, sanding between each coat with 600 grit sandpaper. So after the finish was applied to the panels, I could cut the arc on the upper rail and test fit the doors before gluing them up. The glue up went really well. The most challenging thing was getting good clamping pressure across the upper rail. Applying pressure here would cause the upper rail to bow, which would cause the shoulders of the tenons not to seat properly on the stiles. Once the glue was dry, I gave the door frames a rough sanding, and then I could route the beaded roundover on the outside edges of the doors. Next I could start working on rabbeting the doors. The right door is rabbeted over the left door, and I'm cutting these rabbets first. This is basically a shiplap joint. Next I could cut the rabbets on the other 3 edges of the doors. They are all the same depth at about a ½ inch, but are different widths on each of the 3 remaining edges. So one big problem I encountered while making these doors is I was following some plans that weren't actually correct. They didn't have the size for the rails the right length, so my doors ended up being too narrow for the opening. But luckily I was able to adjust the rabbet in the center to give me just enough space on the outsides to just cover up the very edge of the side stile here. So it did work out all right, although the seam or the center line of the doors is not totally in the center of the case. I think it's off by about 1/4 or 1/8 of an inch. So that's just a small detail, but if I didn't tell you, you probably wouldn't know. So once I had the rabbets cut on the doors, I could hang them with the hardware, the hinges here, and then I could install a half mortise lock in the right door and then the brass catch in the left door. Now the last piece of hardware I have to install are the escutcheons, and I'm not really sure if I like these ones. They might be a little too big. I'm going to get a set of smaller ones and we'll see if I like those better, but that's the last bit of hardware that has to go on the doors. Now if you're curious about how to install one of these half mortise locks, I did do a video about that as well, and there'll be a link to that in the description. I also glossed over the details on how I made these frames with the integral miter bead, and that's because I also did a video about that. I did a very in-depth video about how to actually set everything up and make these doors with this integral bead. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about both of those techniques, I'll leave a link to both those videos in the description. So that's about it for the doors. Thank you as always for watching. I greatly appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments about anything I talked about today or anything here, well, this is my house, but in my shop, please feel free to leave me a comment. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And until next time, happy woodworking.